Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast. We're going to talk today about something I've been calling the post-heroic journey. And to do that, we need to bounce off from the fabled heroic journey or hero's journey of Joseph Campbell. Some of us are familiar with it, some not. If you work in Hollywood, you probably know all about it because it's been turned into a formula for adventure movies and other kinds of drama. And what prompts this discussion is the question that I've asked myself and many people besides, students and colleagues and workshop participants. What's beyond heroism? What does a post-heroic life look like? Why would it even be desirable? Doesn't everybody want to be a hero? Now, in terms of that thing, the hero, Campbell was so broad about it that it's really hard to define it according to how he described it. In his pretty famous interview with Bill Moyers, he said, going off to war is heroism. A woman giving birth is heroic. And it just sounds like everyone who does everything difficult is a hero. He was more specific in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and then other books that he wrote too, where he mentioned the hero. But the basic idea is that somebody receives what Campbell called a call to adventure, and if they accept it, they go down into the underworld, they fight the dragons, they win the prize, and they bring all that back for the benefit of their community. And this is a pattern that Campbell believed to be universal. Underlying it is a pattern of initiation, which is a three-phase archetypal pattern that we might think of as departure, crisis, and return. And by the time the return happens, you're a transformed person. And likewise, in the hero's journey, by the time you're done, you've been turned inside out in the underworld, and you've received some sort of gift or boon or prize or message, and you bring that back to the upper world to the benefit of other people. So what's wrong with that? Well, as far as it goes, nothing. There's a lot of people whose lives conform to that pattern. There's also a lot of people whose lives do not conform to that pattern. And we're going to be interested in that. Also, there's a lot of so-called heroes who don't conform to that pattern. As a matter of fact, the figures that Campbell uses for his hero pattern tend to be pretty idealized figures who fit it pretty well. So Percival is one. I think in some ways Campbell's relationship to Percival was that of an individual to their personal myth. I think Percival's pattern stands behind a lot of Campbell's biography. So Percival was his guy, understandably, in the way that Lancelot stood behind Steinbeck, let's say. And the two men knew each other, by the way. So Percival starts out as an ignorant youth, and he has to go through a lot of hardship. And he eventually becomes one of the best knights of the Round Table. He, in some stories, finds the Holy Grail. He becomes the next Grail King who guards the Holy Grail. And it's a story in some ways not only of coming of age, but actually coming into one's greatness. So that's the kind of pattern that Campbell's telling us about. The rub is that when you read hero stories from many different cultures, or even those from Europe, the hero doesn't always look like that. In fact, if you asked an ancient Greek person what they meant by a hero, they would probably say heroes are really dangerous. Look at Heracles. Look at all the damage he did, right? And there's many examples of heroes like Heracles who never attained any kind of wisdom, prize, boon, or enlightenment. He burned up in a shirt and went to Olympus, which was a nice thing for him to have happen. But the Cuchulainn is another example from Irish mythology. He ended up spurning Maeve, who in many ways is a sort of Irish Aphrodite, Inanna, one of those love and beauty and eros goddesses, but very powerful. Queen Maeve is what she was. And she wanted more closeness with Cuchulainn, and he blew her off. And he died a tragic death because of it. And it wasn't a death that was one of attainment, it was one of ignorance. So there's plenty of examples of heroes around the world who are just dangerous. Gilgamesh is another one who comes to mind, chopping down the forests and offending Ishtar and on and on and on, never obtaining the herb of immortality. And then there are hero figures who, unlike Joseph Campbell's pattern tells us, they actually don't change. They don't transform. So Peach Boy in Japan, he's the same at the end of the story as he was at the beginning. For that matter, Gilgamesh is. He learned some lessons about hubris and the futility of searching for immortality, but at the end of the story, he's boasting about how great his own city is. So he's just as narcissistic at the end as he was at the beginning. The same with the German hero Siegfried. No real change there of the kind Campbell describes in other hero figures. So I'm not going on about this to necessarily criticize Campbell's schema, which I think does work for people. I've taught the hero's journey in men's groups, for instance. But it's a very bad pattern for some men, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. Now, part of the hero's journey is about achieving maturity, and so when it goes well, that's what happens. The hero goes through hardships. He starts out, or she starts out, impulsive. Campbell didn't think there was a heroine's journey, but there is. And we could, if we wanted to, just call the whole thing the heroic journey and get the whole gender dimension off it entirely. But sticking to Campbell for a minute, along the hero's journey, the male hero gets straightened out by adversity to some extent and suffering, and then winds up in a more evolved and mature state, which, again, is fine. And in my culture, that of the United States, we have an enormous hero complex. We love to see ourselves and our country as heroic, and it has a dreadful shadow, and that's something else that I wanted to talk about in this broadcast. Just has a huge dark side. The hero, in that sense, in the unconscious sense, is not only reckless, impulsive, and violent, but can't leave other people alone, and which is just absolutely catastrophic. Nevertheless, there are many examples of what I would call genuine heroism at work around the world, as well as in my culture. So when you think of the braveness of first responders and the courage of medical personnel of different kinds, from doctors all the way down, and administrators and staff, who dealt with overflowing hospitals during the first outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was happening around the world too, of course. And so we can think of plenty of examples of heroism, genuine heroism, and heroic behavior. No question about that. I would also point out activists as heroic figures, often at great personal risk and lifelong injury to protect the rights that we still enjoy. Definitely genuine heroes. But the question all this raises, and it was actually in working with activists that it first occurred to me, is what happens when the heroism starts to fade, whether it's through age or the internal call may shift. You know, there's actually stories about that in folklore. There's a Russian story about the Ivan brothers, Ivan and Ivan. That's not going to be confusing, right? And they're both heroically inclined, and one of them in particular rescues Tsar's daughter after Tsar's daughter, and he just at one point says, I just can't take this anymore. I need to be done with this rescuing. So what happens when the hero gets to that point, or the heroine for that matter? What happens when they wear out, or they just don't feel called to be heroic anymore? What happens for those of us who never feel called to the hero path, ever? Is there nothing we can contribute, right? So I have a somewhat unique view on this, I think, which I should mention at this point, just so you know what some of my biases are about it. I come from a family of heroes, two families of heroes, actually, when I think about it. So birth and adoptive families. I'm adopted, and Many years ago, I got in touch with my birth families and have been involved with them ever since to varying degrees. And so that family in particular, just full of heroes on both sides. Soldiers and special forces, this and that. And one of my aunts was a forest ranger, a firefighter, a paramedic. She actually looped a helicopter upside down. I didn't even know that was possible. Um, and those stories go all the way back through the history, primarily through the mother line, but the guys are also in there too. I have an uncle who broke his ankle in a jump, and then came down on it and had to fight anyway. Things like that, and um, it goes far back in the history of both of my families. That sort of behavior. So it was interesting to grow up with that, and then I went through a phase when I was younger where uh, I kind of got bit by the hero bug and was into saving and rescuing for a while, which can be very risky, actually. I pulled someone out of a seaside cave about a second or two before the whole thing came down in an avalanche after a storm. That was probably not the smartest thing to do, but I'm glad I did it because it saved her life. Other people's too. For a while, I counseled violent men in different settings. I talked men out of shooting their families when they were having a fit of rage. I've administered first aid, I don't know how many times. So I got at least a taste of it, but it got really tiring because that's not where I live. I'm a quiet person and not a heroic one. And I remember at one point a bit of trickster energy entered the picture. I was walking down the street in my early 30s, and a woman in a car came streaking out of nowhere and collided with a fire plug across the street, and then copious amounts of steam came out of the car. And I thought, will these people ever stop crashing when I'm in the vicinity? I don't know how many people more I got to pull out of cars that are like this. And so I ran across the street and tried to get her door open. It was jammed. And suddenly she sat up and gave me a scared look and actually managed to back the car up. I didn't even think it would run because of all the steam pouring out of it. It was the radiator, I guess. But she backed the car up and took off. And only later did I realize she was probably running away from a drunk driver charge. But that was a signal to me, not only of the trickster coming in and kind of having a good laugh at me, but as well as the ending of those, quote, heroic years of my life. Things were much quieter after that, I'm happy to report. So I think the reason for it was to give me a little bit more empathy for my relatives, for one thing, but also for the people I work with, my students, and in those days, therapy clients. I don't do therapy anymore. But my understanding of the hero's journey deepened but also shifted at that point because I began to see the limitations of it. And all the while in my psychological training and my own psychotherapy, I was noticing how consistently and how forcibly I and the other men in my family got pressed into a kind of hero pattern, mostly at the unconscious level, the way families do things, and how the sense of responsibility for other people's lives and always having to be on and always having to be the person making the bold decisions and all of that stuff, how destructive that could be. What a huge load it put on people. And, for both my fathers, actually destroying their bodies as well as their spirit. My dad, the man I grew up with, destroyed his body in college football and never entirely recovered from that. He was bow-legged for most of his adult life until he had his knees replaced, and there were other scars too, but especially on his heart. And my birth father had fought in very bloody ground wars in Korea and never recovered from that, had horrible post-traumatic stress for the rest of his life. So between those two men and also the men I worked with for 6 years in men's groups, some combat veterans, but also other men in other walks of life who had got similar hero conditioning, I really got a good sense of how absolutely destructive this hero pattern can be. Now, I want to say that if I had been able to talk to Joseph Campbell about it, which I never was, he probably would have said, yeah, that's not what I meant by the hero's journey. That's like an unconscious, horrible, tragic thing, And I would agree with that. But The model of the hero itself, I would argue, is highly problematic for people who don't really fit it. It's not good as a general template, and it makes demands that I think a lot of us can't live up to. So that's as much as I'll say in terms of a criticism of it. But having said that, I'll also say that I've met people who, and not just men, who actually fit the pattern really well, and they have heroic lives and they lead heroic lives, and they should, and that's where they live. So, all power to them. But let's go now to what a post-heroic life would look like. And I'm reminded here of some cartoons. I forget the name of the artist. You can probably find him on the internet, but he did a series of cartoons about an aging superhero who is still trying to run around and right wrongs and punch bad guys, and he looked like he was in his 60s or 70s and just having a terrible time of it. So I thought it was an interesting commentary on the whole superhero mentality itself. So we come to post-heroism, I think, in different ways. I mentioned some of them earlier. Some of us never felt called into the hero pattern. Some of us got sick of it. Some of us maybe outgrew it. Maybe we liked it when it was younger, but didn't like it so much as we got older. Some of us got worn out by it. But in any case, I want to focus on what is left for the non-heroes to do in terms of trying to make a better world, trying to leave the world better than we find it. So I'm going to do a podcast on something called enchantivism, which I'll only briefly touch on here. Enchantivism is a term I coined some years ago for a kind of storytelling, whether it's writing the stories down or performing them or art or film or theater or what have you, in which we are invited to imagine a world better than the one that we live in. And so when you think about Nichelle Nichols as a black actor in Star Trek, and people watching, including Martin Luther King, who was a fan of that show when it aired in the 60s, and seeing themselves represented, seeing that the future is not only white, it made a huge impact on people. There are astronauts of color who point back at that and say, that motivated me to keep going, which is a tremendous service that she did. So enchantivism, it may start in injustice or rupture, and it may not, but it invites us into a different kind of imagining about how we want to live and who we want to live with and what our world could look like. So although it has a utopic flavor, I tend to avoid the word utopic because it's come to mean foolishly idealistic. And also, as one of my fictional characters says in one of my stories, there are no impregnable utopias. We always have to be vigilant. So no matter how great a world we make, we have human beings living in it, and we are mortal and imperfect, and there will always be something for us to fix, right, about ourselves. So not utopia in that sense, but in the sense of we can do better than this because we can be better than this, right? So to go a little further with this post-heroic idea, I would like to summon forth a character from folklore, from the Mabinogion, actually, the Welsh tales and the collection of Welsh tales. And this character goes by different names. Manawydan is one of his names. And in Ireland, he's called Manannán mac Lir. And he's usually thought of as a god of the sea because that's where he hangs out. But we have to be careful of the attribute approach to mythic figures because it doesn't really tell us who the characters are deep down. So, for instance, both Zeus and Thor throw lightning, so they're thought of as lightning or thunder gods, but they're completely different in character. Thor is a hero god, no question about that. He leads a heroic life. He undergoes heroic journeys and actually develops in the Campbellian sense. He learns, he evolves. Zeus is more of a distant father god, and his personality is very different from Thor's. So archetypally, he's different. So that's why we can't trust the attributes thing. We have to go by what the gods actually do and what their styles are, or any mythic figure. So likewise with Manawyddan, I think we could think of him as a magus, as a mage, a wizard or alchemist. He's that kind of personality. So he belongs in the same archetypal family as, say, Merlin or Gwydion, any of the great magicians. Odin would be one of them. And so what makes him interesting for us is that he actually had a heroic life when he was younger. He even was a warrior and a military leader at some point, but he gave all that up. And so there's a story where he's with his heroic friend Pryderi, and at one point a magic castle appears on Pryderi's ground. And Pryderi says, "Where the hell did that come from, and why did it appear without anybody asking me if it could be here?" Because he owns that land. So he says, "Let's charge in and confront these people." At which point Manawyddan says, "Now wait a minute. This big thing just appeared here. We have no idea how it got here. We don't know what powers were involved. Let's think about what our approach should be." And Pryderi basically says, "Screw that," and he runs inside. So he runs up to a fountain because he's thirsty, and he goes to drink from it, and he freezes solid. He's trapped. So his mother Rhiannon comes along. And Pryderi says, "Look, your son just ran in there. He hasn't come out again. We got to figure out what to do. We need a plan." And Rhiannon says, "Why didn't you go in after him?" She runs in there, drinks from the fountain. She gets caught. The whole castle then disappears. So Pryderi's distraught wife says, "Now what are we going to do?" And Manawyddan says, "We're going to watch, we're going to wait, and we're going to work." And so as they're working, they take up different trades to make a living in different parts of the land. And Pryderi, as a magician, as a wizard, is getting stronger and stronger senses that there's an enemy magician at work behind all this. And so he doesn't say much, but he's doing his homework. And so by the end of the story, which I won't go further with, he's the one who confronts the enemy magician, and he works a peace. It turns out that there was a blood feud involving Pryderi's family. And so Manawyddan forces the other magician into agreeing to let the feud go. So he not only solves the situation and brings back Pryderi and Rhiannon, but he brings lasting peace to that land. That's how post-heroes work. That's how people who are beyond heroism deal with things thoughtfully, reflectively, wisely. They too have their own style of bravery. It takes something for Manawyddan to confront an unknown, invisible enemy he knows has it in for all of them. So it's not as though he's lacking in courage, but it takes a different expression. And he works with a more symbolic way of giving messages to this enemy magician to let him know, I'm on to you and I'm going to be formidable as an opponent. There's one other figure I want to mention in this connection, and this would be Princess Bari from Korea. Princess Bari is adopted. She was turned out of her birth parents' house for not being male. Turns out she was, of course, the most precious thing ever born into it, and they would pay dearly to get her back. In fact, they're going to die if they don't. So, meanwhile, she's raised by commoners, and she goes on what we could think of as the heroine's journey. She learns woodcraft, she learns patience, she's brave, she's enterprising, and when she meets her birth parents and discovers that she has 6 sisters, and her birth parents say, we need someone to go find the elixir of life or we're going to die, she's the only one with the nerve to say, I'll go. At which point her birth mother thanks her, and Princess Bari says, you don't need to thank me. You carried me in your womb for 9 months. That's thanks enough. And she gets on her horse and goes. And of course she succeeds. But in this version of the story, there's also a post-heroic piece because she unites 2 families as she does all this. So she not only saves her family, but she unites it with another family that she has become a part of during her own learning, during her own apprenticeship. So, although in some ways she's a heroine, in many ways she's already. So, she would be another figure that we could learn from. So, if you want more examples of these post heroic protagonists who make change in the world, I actually have a chapter on this in my book, Myths Among Us. So, you might pick that up. But meanwhile, some thoughts for reflection on this post heroic path. So, one possible point of departure for us would be this whole issue of achievement. Heroes tend to achieve great things, things that nobody else can do. But the post heroic path seems more about maturation. It asks, how am I to become a mature human being? Emotionally mature, to some extent intellectually mature, educated, cultured, but also polite, humble, understanding the obligations of my relationships and understanding my place in my community, that kind of maturity. And I would say that the post-heroic path is also about a path of enchantment and wonder. So heroes get a lot of praise for going out and exploring and seeing wondrous things and all that. But I think with the post-heroic path, there's a sense in which everything becomes wondrous, which sounds like a big claim until it actually happens to you. When you have a sense that everything has its own presence, perhaps its own aliveness, its own symbolic meaning in your life, then all of a sudden you live in a world where you're surrounded by presences and forms of life that address you and not really alone anymore. And I think that's its own kind of achievement. So there's a possibility for the post-heroic path. Also, I think of the post-heroic figures in folklore as well as in daily life as being out to change external conditions, not directly the way heroes do, but through changes in collective consciousness. So there's a word I use sometimes, trans-revolution. A revolution is where you replace the people at the top and oftentimes business goes on as usual, or it reverts to that eventually. Trans-revolution is about lasting systemic change. And so I see post-heroes and post-heroines as the people who are behind that kind of change. They're trying to lead by example, to live their values, and to offer visions of better places that we can all walk. Changing consciousness, both personally and collectively. When you think about it, the really hard work in the world is about changing hearts, isn't it? I mean, any fool can kill people or make people do things, but to be able to actually reach into the heart of somebody else and have them see your heart is much more difficult. Particularly when you're on opposite sides of some ideology. I think a post-hero or a post-heroine is somebody who can step forward and say, this is where I'm really coming from. This is why I care about these things. I'm not here to harangue you or talk you down or beat you down with logic or out-argue you or out-shout you. I'm here to offer to collaborate with you so that we can have a cleaner, more creative, and more humane way to go forward together. And the nice thing about that is that anyone can do that. It doesn't take heroics. Anybody can offer something soulful. And it may be in the end that that's actually what makes change. Because when we offer a little of ourselves, it invites other people to see things differently. So I'm going to give the last word to Ursula K. Le Guin, who had this to say in her novel Tahanu. There is a kind of reversal to serve power that isn't a revolt or a rebellion, but a revolution in the sense of reversing meanings, of changing how things are understood. Anyone who has been able to break the grip of a controlling, crippling belief or bigotry or enforced ignorance knows the sense of coming out into the light and air, of release, of being set free to fly, to transcend. Thank you.